So moving on to video number 2. So yeah, I was talking about autism and the pitfalls associated now with the diagnosis, the way it's been completely broadened out into this whole amorphous spectrum without any clear divisions, which I feel is extremely problematic. Yes, obviously the definitions of autism do change, as with any psychiatric diagnosis. It's organic, you know, it moves, it's never, you know, it's never static, because, you know, as with increasing knowledge and scientific advances, obviously conditions do move, you know, that's as it should be. But when a condition becomes so extremely broad that you start to think that, as one of my viewers said in comments, you know, that maybe in a decade time, it'll be so common as to be basically meaningless. You do start to think, hang on a minute, something's not right. What you then start to think is, I think it's called diagnostic bleed, I read somewhere, where a condition starts to increasingly lose shape. It becomes so amorphous that it's like it's wobbly, you know, like it literally wobbles out. It no longer has any kind of clear lines around it. And then what happens is, either the condition loses all validity, or you start to go back to the drawing board and carve up the condition again, so that you do have more meaningful subgroups. Again, obviously diagnostic bleed happens again you might need to carve it up again, and so on. So I think there are two issues with autism. I think that it's both underdiagnosed and overdiagnosed, to be quite frank. I think it's underdiagnosed in often in those people in what I call the squeezed middle, who can appear more able than they actually are and might not be conventionally stereotypical in the very rigid sense of the word. That's to say, they're not TV autism, which, as I mentioned in my other video, is a bit of a fiction anyway, sort of Rain Man kind of stereotype. But nevertheless, they do have very real struggles. And I do feel that there's a lot of underdiagnosis and people having to wait years for diagnosis and not getting supported properly. And I think this particularly, I mean, it happens today, it hasn't stopped, but particularly in the 1990s when I grew up, there's a tendency not to diagnose people with conditions, but just to label their symptoms. Like, for example, when I was at primary school, I was put under special educational needs. I was obviously different, you know, there's no hiding it, but they just listed all of my symptoms, said I needed this support, which didn't really happen anyway, but, you know, basically put into the slow stream, and you're sort of like a list of symptoms that you have, but not given an actual label. Because back in the 90s, they were very, very reluctant to give labels, and they usually just listed the symptoms. And I've heard this a lot from other people who go to some of my autism groups, who also put under special educational needs, but weren't actually given a diagnosis as such. It was more just for their symptoms, and they got diagnosed autistic in adulthood. So it seemed to be quite a common phenomenon in the 90s. But yeah, so I do feel there's a lot of underdiagnosis for people who do have proper disabilities, and that is still happening now, unfortunately. And this is usually what I call the squeezed middle, because obviously if you're like really profoundly autistic, you know, it's really obvious, and that's like for ones who are like non-verbal and stuff, nearly always will get diagnosed in childhood, although even some of them will have to wait. But at the other end of the scale, I do believe, and this is controversial, but I'm going to say I don't care, I do believe that there is overdiagnosis as well. Now, when I say this, I don't mean that these people shouldn't be diagnosed, full stop, because I actually think it's a really good thing that people are getting diagnosed, and I think it's a really progressive thing that people should be able to access the right help they need. But I think that we do need to have diagnostic rigour, and I don't think it's good when a condition has been broadened out to pure meaninglessness. And with autism, there used to be a very key, there was a key part of the criteria that had to be considered before you gave someone a diagnosis, and that was the clinically significant impairment. So, in other words, it's not enough just to have traits, because if that was the case, my brother could be diagnosed autistic. He's got lots of traits. My dad could be diagnosed autistic. He's got a lot of traits. I can think of many people who have traits but who aren't autistic because they don't meet that key definition, clinically significant impairment. So it has to disable them, it has to cause them problems, it has to be more than just, say, a slight eccentricity or, a slight peculiarity, shall we say, like of a common garden variety. It has to be more than that, because otherwise you could end up diagnosing more than half the population, and that wouldn't make sense, would it? And I feel that this key thing has become lost. And, like, for example, when you hear celebrities like Melanie Sykes getting diagnosed with the same condition I have, you think, hang on a minute, something isn't right here. Like, I used to think I was, like, one of the most high-functioning autistics because, okay, I am very disabled, but, compared to, say, someone in nappies and that sort of classic end, I do have an intellect, I don't need to be constantly supervised all the time, I do have some agency, I can communicate verbally relatively okay, but I do still have great struggles with communication, but it's like a lot more subtle. And I used to think, I'm autistic, I struggle a lot, but I'm one of the more high-functioning ones. Nowadays, I'm not so sure, and that's not because I've become more impaired, it's because the goalposts have changed. So now we're seeing like these extremely able people, like Melanie Sykes, getting diagnosed. So clearly I'm no longer high functioning because that's the new high functioning. It's changed. Now I must be middle functioning. Not because I've become more impaired, but simply because the goalposts have changed. But I just don't feel it's right. I do feel it's becoming overdiagnosed at the very extremely able end, and because these people may well have traits. Melanie Sykes got a son who's autistic, but just because they've got traits, and after all it is a genetic condition, so it's very likely that a parent of a child is going to have at least some sort of shadow effect, if you want to call it that, where the child's condition is mirrored a little bit in the adult, but maybe not to the same extent as the child. And some of these will be truly autistic and are clinically significantly impaired. I know several parents who go to some of the autism groups that I attend who have kids and who are genuinely autistic themselves in a clinically significantly impaired sense. They might have slightly better social skills than what I've got. I have no idea how to make a relationship happen, but they're clearly significantly impaired, at least in some other respects, and that's obvious. They properly struggle in their life, and it really does hold them back. But I do feel that just because someone's kid is autistic, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are. But what's often happening now is that having a child who's autistic is almost enough, if they've got traits, to get a diagnosis, regardless of whether or not that clinically significant impairment is in place. And I just feel that this is a slippery slope, and it's becoming increasingly broad, and also penalises against those people who don't have kids. You might find it harder to get a diagnosis because they don't have a child who's autistic to kind of act as a kind of leverage, if you like. Because I feel some clinicians just see the fact they've got a child who's autistic, know they've got traits, and bam, give them an autism diagnosis because it runs in the family. So what I'm saying is, I do think it's good that people get diagnosed. I'm not against diagnosis, but I feel that a condition should not be over. I do think autism is going overdiagnosed. So what I feel should happen is that these people like Melanie Sykes shouldn't be getting diagnosed autistic. They should be getting diagnosed with something else. Maybe they could put it under the autism umbrella, maybe like a related condition. But I feel that maybe they need to kind of give it a different name so that it's not, because otherwise, like, it actually ends up affecting people who do need more help, because it becomes harder to advocate, because like, autism used to be seen as a really serious condition, but now when you say autism, people are like, well, that can mean anything, and like, it's no longer a code word for being severely disabled. Basically, you now have to like start talking at length about all your struggles, and it should like just to prove that you are disabled, basically, and you're entitled to this support, because it's become watered down. And I feel that this is particularly affecting a squeezed middle, because those who are profoundly autistic already look disabled anyway, and they have parents and stuff to do their advocacy for them. and they already look profoundly disabled, so no one's in any doubt that they need support. But the squeezed out middle, you can appear more able than they actually are. Like in the past, if you said autism, people would be like, well, that's serious. Now, because of these people like Melanie Sykes and these extremely able people, and if you appear more able than you are, like myself, like me, because I can talk so well, you know, and I can appear at first impressions normal, even though actually I can talk well, but I can't keep relationships going for toffee, and I am actually pretty disabled and excluded from society, and have real executive functioning impairments and stuff like that. But because I can appear so normal, people don't understand. Like, they don't understand I actually need someone to do stuff for me because I appear so normal. They're like, well, you should be able to do it. But it's because I appear more normal than I actually am, which is really hurtful. And it's kind of, in a sense, means that my ability to appear more normal becomes an extra disability. But it used to be that if you said autism, people are like, okay, that's serious. Now, well, no, look, Melanie Sykes has got it. She's normal, pretty normal, you know. And like, I just feel that, yeah, it's kind of hurting people who have more needs, and I feel that maybe they do need to kind of split up the diagnosis into different categories to create more meaning, really. So I'm not against people like Melanie Sykes getting diagnosed as such, but what I am against is them getting diagnosed with the same condition as me without any subgrouping. So, I don't know, they should maybe, because autism is now becoming too wobbly, they need to basically, and to prevent diagnostic bleed and to create more diagnostic internal validity, they need to create new subgroups. And, you know, a bit like I have with other conditions, like type 1, type 2, type 3 or whatever. But I don't know, it probably needs to be a bit more precise than that. And I'm not sure, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not sure how this should happen. But I don't like the status quo. I don't like this whole, the way autism now is just becoming so broad that it's becoming, yes, all autistic people are different. Yes, there's great diversity within the autism, but it shouldn't be so diverse that it becomes meaningless. There becomes a point where you have to close it up, you know, and that clinically significant impairment is the key. It has to be a clinically significant impairment, and that's where I feel the diagnosis is just losing kind of shape, if you like. You know, where people who essentially don't really have any disability, like Mel Sykes, you know, celebrities, millionaires. I mean, you know, even a neurotypical would struggle to do what she does, and that's just becoming rather absurd. Okay, so thank you for watching.